So welcome. First off, I want to thank you all for giving up your lunch hour to join us this afternoon. It's great to see so many folks here and interested in talking about farmland ownership and stewardship. My name is Jorgen Rose. I am a program coordinator with Practical Farmers of Iowa. I have just a few housekeeping items and some context to share with you all this afternoon before I turn it over to our speakers to get to the good stuff that you probably all came here to hear. If you joined us last week, I apologize. Some of this housekeeping might seem a little repetitive. First off, I do want to acknowledge that this workshop series is a collaboration between four organizations: the Des Moines Water Works, Heartland Cooperative, People's Company, and Practical Farmers of Iowa. And I think you'll find this is a pretty unusual partnership between four fairly different organizations. And I think, like I mentioned last week, this really just speaks to the importance of this issue of farmland ownership and farm stewardship and thoughtful and intentional farmland management. I'm going to let the folks from each organization introduce themselves and their organizations and what they do over the next couple of workshops as we hear from each of them directly. But I did want to share a little bit about Practical Farmers of Iowa up front. So Practical Farmers of Iowa is a member-based farmer and landowner-led organization working across Iowa and in surrounding states to equip farmers to build resilient farms and communities. And we do that through a few different ways, primarily through our on-farm research program, and then through educational and outreach events like this one. So if you're interested in learning more about Practical Farmers of Iowa, you can visit our website, practicalfarmers.org, and learn more about the myriad of things that we do. You can also drop me an email, jorgen@practicalfarmers.org, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have. I also want to introduce my coworker here, who's handling the tech for us. Megan Sweeney is an AmeriCorps member in our office, so if you hear her voice chime in, she's helping us out with the tech today. So the goal in planning this workshop series, when our four organizations really got together, was just to provide information and resources to landowners who are interested in learning more about farmland management and farmland stewardship. And the theme for today's workshop, Rhythms of Agriculture, is really about trying to provide a snapshot of what farmland renters, what the farmers are thinking and how they make decisions, and then to cover in broad strokes what landlords need to know about farming and agriculture in order to effectively communicate with their tenants, build solid rental partnerships, and make decisions about farmland stewardship. So our agenda today is very straightforward. Once I'm done with my housekeeping items here, I'm going to provide some context on land ownership trends in Iowa and what we know from survey and census data. Then I'm going to turn it over to Mike and Charles Helen, both Polk County farmers, and have them share with us what a year in the life of a farmer looks like. And then we'll hear from Ruth McCabe of Heartland Cooperative about what a cooperative is and what tools farmers are using to make decisions on their farms. And then we'll hear from Molly Aronowitz of People's Company about professional farmland management services and how those services can help both farmers and landlords. First, though, I do just want to provide a little info on how we're going to handle question and answer time and some of the Zoom tools that we'll be using. So throughout any of our presentations this afternoon, and at any time, you should always feel free to type questions or comments into the chat box. And we'll be monitoring that chat box. If the questions are quick and easy and useful clarifying questions, and if it's not too disruptive, we may ask them immediately or just following the presentation. We are more likely, though, to hold on to any questions that come in through the chat box until our Q&A time at the end. And we should have plenty of time for Q&A. So if we don't get to your question right away, don't worry, we won't forget about you. We're going to do our best to make sure all the questions get answered. Also, when you do chat, make sure that the to box is set to everyone. So we want everyone to be able to see the questions that you're asking, not just us here on the panel. During the Q&A and discussion period at the end, we will invite you all to unmute and ask questions to our speakers verbally. And you can indicate that by using the raise hand feature under participants. Until the Q&A time, however, we are going to make sure that everyone stays muted. So if we mute you, don't take it personally. We just want to make sure that our speakers can get through their presentations without being disrupted. This workshop is really for you all. So whether you type or speak your questions, we really want to encourage you to stay engaged, ask questions, participate in discussion. I think you'll find that you get a lot more out of the conversation if you do that. Also, as always, please remember to stay respectful. We've got a broad audience today. I'm sure we all have different opinions on any numbers of issues. And I don't think anyone in this virtual workshop will claim to have all the answers. I know I certainly do not, but I think that we have plenty of good questions, which is our goal today. And last, my last housekeeping item, at the conclusion of this workshop series, in about a month or so, 3 or 4 weeks, everyone who registered for at least one of these workshops is going to receive an evaluation email with a link. And so we would really appreciate if you would click that link, take a few minutes, tell us how we did during this workshop series. We really value that feedback, and we use that feedback to make our programming better. So when you see that email, don't ignore it. Please take a few minutes, click that link, and tell us how we did. And so now I'm going to launch into providing some land ownership context. First, I have a little poll. Megan, maybe we can launch that poll. Here we go. So this poll is anonymous. We would appreciate it if you take a minute and answer some of the questions here. And it's multiple choice, so you can choose all that apply. I am going to go ahead and continue on with our context. So I just want to take a few minutes before we start talking today and share some information from a few different sources, primarily the 2017 Census of Agriculture, the Iowa Land Ownership and Tenure Survey conducted by Iowa State, and the Farm and Rural Life Poll conducted by Iowa State. And my goal in sharing this information is not to point any fingers, but rather just to provide the lay of the land and what we think we know about farmland ownership here in Iowa based on some of these surveys and census data. And so I think the big thing, as we really referenced last week, is it's critical to understand that the majority of farmland in Iowa is rented. And that percentage of rented farmland changes based on where you are in the state, but I love this graphic. You can see here that in the 2017 census, the average proportion of rented land statewide was 51%. I think that's probably higher now. I think that's probably more like 55 to 60% statewide average. But you can see in some of these counties, it's approaching 70% and probably now well over 70% rented land. So what this really means in practical terms is that the majority of farmland, and in some counties, the vast majority of farmland, is not farmed by the same people who own it. And that means the decisions about that farmland and about conservation and stewardship on that farmland are necessarily and automatically more complicated because there's more than one party involved, and sometimes many more than one party involved. So what does this survey information tell us about landowners? And by landowners, I really mean you all in our audience. So again, these numbers are self-reported by landowners on survey, and I'm curious to see from our poll if some of these things resonate. But first of all, we know that about a quarter of our landowners here in Iowa live still on the land. We know that 33% of them don't live on the farm itself, but still live in the same county. And then 10% live in adjacent counties, 13% live somewhere else, and 19% live outside of Iowa. But we also know that those last 3 categories are really growing, and the first 2 categories are shrinking. So the takeaway here in practical terms is that the number of landlords with close ties to farming are decreasing. And that's just through the natural transfer of land ownership down through the generations as kids and grandchildren inherit farmland. So one thing I hear a lot from landowners, and is really borne out of the survey data, is that because they've never lived on the farm, they feel really, or farm themselves, they feel really uncomfortable understanding agriculture and talking to their farm tenants about farming. And there are also relatively few resources out there for landowners to help them address those questions directly. So this is undeniably a really steep learning curve for many landowners, especially when they first take ownership of land. It's one of the major barriers to communication, this knowledge gap, and it's really what some of us, what this workshop today is intended to address. So then what does the survey data tell us about farmland tenants? Well, first of all, most farmland operators have more than one landlord. So the average farmer in Iowa has 3 landlords, but over 20%, or 1 in 5 farmers has 4 or more. And I think we'll hear from Mike and Charles that they have a few more than that. So this further complicates a farmer's decision-making, right? You don't necessarily want to be doing things drastically different from one farm to another. You also can't decide all by yourself just to change the way that you farm in its entirety. You have all these landlords that you have these partnerships with that you're trying to work with. So surveys also reveal that farmers tend to rent the same farmland for a long time. You know, the average tenure of a farmer on a piece of rented ground is 20 years in Iowa. But it also reveals that those leases are typically year-to-year annual leases. And so this also injects uncertainty into a farmer's decision-making, as there's always that chance that they won't have the opportunity to farm that land next year. And this varies by farmer and varies by rental relationship, but this has the potential to limit a farmer's willingness to make conservation investment that have longer-term benefits for soil health and ecosystem services on the farm that they may not be able to reap themselves. So one big question that came up last week and will probably come up today, and we're really going to talk about in some depth next week, is this question of who's responsible for paying for conservation. We can see here that landlords don't often self-report that they've invested in conservation on their farms. This might be a little skewed because there's often not a good understanding of what constitutes an investment in conservation. But this result really aligns well with this trend of frustration between tenants and landlords about who's going to pay for different conservation practices. Some research shows that farm operators, farmers, feel that farmland owners, landlords aren't willing to invest in conservation or renegotiate leasing terms to offset the cost of implementing conservation practices, especially in these annual year-to-year leases. Research also indicates that landowners, are frustrated with tenants who won't consider implementing even practices that have potential short-term benefits like cover crops, and that landlords and landowners often feel ill-equipped to have those conversations or feel that they're being dismissed by their farmland tenants because they don't know enough about agriculture. So, I get calls every week from farmers who want resources and help talking to their landlord or landowner about different conservation practices, and I get calls from landowners who want to have conversations with their tenants about the same things. And I often wonder to myself how often those two groups really overlap, and it's just a communication barrier. So just a few other trends here. Farm tenants may underestimate the importance that landlords place on stewardship. Farm tenants often view landlords as unsupportive of conservation practices and unwilling to share in conservation investment. And on both sides, there's this unwillingness or this fear of rocking the boat. So both sides really view each other as unsupportive of trying new things or pursuing new conservation practices. So in order for farmers and landowners to have these better conversations, it seems obvious that we need to reduce this information gap and communications gap and provide some strategies. So we get asked by landowners frequently to help them better understand their farms and agriculture in general. And so that is the goal of today's particular workshop in this series. So with that, Megan, maybe we can go ahead and publish the survey results. Great. So hopefully you're all seeing these survey results. It looks like we have a wide range, right? So some of us really enjoy and have really good conversations with our tenants about farmland practices and conservation practices. Some of us have talked about conservation in the past, but don't talk about it very frequently or haven't talked about it recently. Some would like to, but feel they don't know enough. Some would like to talk with their tenant, but are concerned about how they may react. And some have tried to talk with their tenant and just haven't had much success. So today we're really going to focus on what landowners need to know about agriculture, trying to address that information gap. Next week, our workshop's really going to focus on some of those communication strategies, some of those leasing strategies, some of those relationship and partnership building strategies to help make these things a reality on the ground. So I'm going to pause. We have a couple minutes for questions if there are any. I don't see any in the chat currently. Give people just a minute. If there's a question, feel free to type it in. All right, so at Practical Farmers, we really believe that farmers and landowners learn best from other farmers and landowners. So we've asked two farmers, Mike and Charles Helen, who farm in northern Polk County, to give us an overview of the day and life of a farmer. So Mike and Charles are brothers. They farm in Polk County. Like I said, they rent from several landlords. Why don't we go ahead and unmute Mike and Charles, and we can get your slide shared.
Yeah, hey everybody, my name is Ruth McCabe and I'm actually with Heartland Cooperative, and I am also serving as the background IT for Mike and Charles. So I'm going to get this fired up for them real fast, and then you will hear from them.
And we'll hear from Ruth in more detail later.
Yeah, you will hear from me. You will hear, you're not going to escape that. You will all hear from me soon. All right. You guys are good to go. You guys can hear us, right? Pretty sure they can hear us. Okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
It's all right. How about it go up and down?
Okay, I'm Mike Helland, and this is my brother Charles. We do farm in Polk County. We also farm in Story and Boone County. Not as big as it sounds because we live right on the corners of Boone and Story and Polk, so they all come together there. We've been asked to talk about the year in the life of a farmer, and when's a good time to talk about conservation and no-till and cover crops and so forth with your tenant. I would say most any time of year, wouldn't you? And
Yes, any time of the year. Communication is good all the time. Building a relationship is good. It makes it easier to talk to each other at any time.
As tenants, we've got all kinds of information, yield information and fertility and things like that landlords may be interested in, but they usually don't ask for it, and it'd be easy to provide that. Cover cropping does take a little bit of planning ahead of time, and there's a learning curve with that. If somebody's already no-tilling, that's a big advantage. If not, then they really kind of need to learn two steps at one time. And I always encourage farmers to just take 40 or 80 acres and just start experimenting with it. And we have been doing that for about 8 years, primarily on ground that we own or the family owns, mostly because it is a long-term benefit, and really the landowner is the one that's going to benefit the most from it. So getting into the why is it not moving?
I don't know. Oh, I guess you have to click. I'll click.
Okay. This is kind of a screenshot of what we're going to be talking about, the different segments of the year. And as you can see in the center, the marketing goes on year round. We'll market grain up to 1.5 years before we harvest it, and could be 6 to 10 months after we harvest it.
So this starts in the fall. Hopefully harvest is wrapping up, hopefully by the middle of November. And after that, we'll have some fertilizer to apply if possible, weather permitting. You never know. It could be too muddy. One year the ground froze for the winter on November 6th, so then you're done for the year. And in this time, hopefully after harvest, if there's some time, that's when you'll have time to work on waterways if there's a problem. Seed cover crops if you didn't do it during the growing season, and other land possibly issues from water or whatever. At the end of November is typically when we have to pay for seed. And the reason for that is the varieties that are most popular go first. The better discounts are in November timeframe. And as you go on through the winter, you know, the better seed that you may want will be taken by other farmers. We used to get to do this in February, and they have backed it up, so they want your money sooner. And the chemicals, kind of the same thing. As soon as the suppliers get the chemical prices, then we will typically prepay either in December or 1st of January for the best discounts. And another thing we do in November, December is talk to the tax man and prepare for the end of the year. You can juggle income and expenses to make your taxes work out kind of even from year to year best you can. It's kind of a game you play to try to get these things all done. Sometimes harvest with weather a problem will take you into the holidays, and then we are the holiday haters club that we don't want to stop for holidays because we have too much work to do, and that doesn't always improve family life. So I guess that's mostly it for the November through February timeframe.
So,
Oh, I got it.
okay, then getting into the March through May timeframe. March 1st is rent, when rent is due, and most land payments. That's always a very stressful day. That's a lot of money going out the door. Weather permitting, we'll be getting into the field as soon as possible to finish up whatever fall fertilizer we didn't get done, or anhydrous. Be working on any kind of broken tile that developed over the winter time, or waterways and so forth. Doing a lot of maintenance on machinery, getting ready to gear up, ready to go. Changing oil, field cultivator sweeps, planter openers, spacing, just all kinds of things like that. And again, as soon as the weather permits, we'll start spraying our pre-emerge herbicides, and hope to start planting around the 15th to the 20th of April. And then hopefully get done planting. We like to be done by the 1st of May, or at least the 10th of May on both corn and beans.
It's kind of a common misconception sometimes with people in town. They think when the sidewalk is dry, you should be able to go to the field, but it doesn't work that way.
It could be several days, but if you get 2 inches of rain, you might be out for a week or more. The last few years have been kind of interesting. We've had a lot of rainy weather without a lot of rain. So you just day after day, you're only hours away from being able to go to the field, but instead of getting sun and wind, you get maybe 0.05 of an inch of rain. Instead, it's just misty, foggy.
Well, and
You can't quite get there.
with no sun, it doesn't matter how much wind, it does not dry
Yeah.
out until the sun comes out.
And planters and things like that don't work well in tacky soil. And it's an absolute no-no to be out there planting when it's wet. So, and contrary to popular belief, when we get done planting, we don't take the rest of summer off either. That's what invariably we'll get that question. Now that you're done planting, what are you gonna do the rest of summer?
That's actually perfect. All my summer.
So in the summer, all we do is go to the lake for 3 months, and that's it. That's all I got to say about that. Now in the summer is spraying time to take care of weeds, possibly bugs, hopefully not bugs. That's one of my worst things I spray, because all it is to save what you already had. It doesn't usually gain you anything. And then sometimes we have some extra nitrogen to put on depending on the situation. Again, machinery maintenance, that kind of goes on throughout the year. And then in the summer, we get another opportunity for more prepays. Depending on the year, our anhydrous ammonia might be cheaper in the summer, so we'll prepay that for the following crop year. And sometimes propane we will prepay in the summer. That's another good time to visit with, have a tenant landlord relationship. We have, I don't know, around a dozen landlords. Some of them interested in conservation, some of them interested in money. And it makes a difference. Everyone is a different deal, and a relationship is important to me in a farm operation with the landlord, because then nobody is so worried about having communication.
Yeah, the more money you're able to make, the less interested in money that the landlords are, and the more long-term relationship it is, the more likely you are to invest in cover crops and things like that, and the long-term fertility. If it's something there where it's, you know, up for rent every 2-3 years for a highest bid, we're not even interested in that.
We don't farm those.
And you're just not going to do anything for the long-term benefit of the farm, because it's just going to be gone and the next person might erase everything you did. So that long-term relationship is very important, at least to us. And we do have a lot of long-term relationships. We got a lot of them that we've been farming for 20 to 40 years. So.
Next slide.
Okay, then getting into the September, October timeframe, it's pretty much harvest. September 1 is the deadline for farmland leases to either terminate them or adjust them. That's kind of from a legal standpoint. We're pretty much open to working with our landlords after that. It is nice to know as soon as possible if you're going to be farming something or not, because you don't want to put fertilizer out there on something you're not going to farm. Things like that.
But a lot of times we will, if the September deadlines come by and we haven't had a lease terminated, we may talk again through the winter or spring and determine what the rent might be for the next year, depending on what the markets have done through the winter. The rent price can always be a bit of a touchy subject. The coffee shop rents are typically higher than what the real rents are out in the real world. And it seems like somehow landlords have a tendency, or coffee shop talk is always talking about the highest ones around. The low rents don't usually come up. Those are kind of quiet. But, you know, here again, it's the high rents are typically, not always, but a lot of times somebody will pay that high rent and the only way they can make any money is to mine that farm and never put fertility back. And if you want your farm maintained properly, then you've got to be willing to talk about things and let us make some money. We had a stretch for about 5 years or 6 before this year that we lost money every year, and most people don't understand how you could lose money through those times, but it's pretty easy. When the prices are low, you have a stretch, maybe the yields aren't the best, and things don't work out the best. And we try to maintain the cash rent so the landlord still makes some money, but that puts us in the red.
And we have had landlords, you know, even offer to, lower the rent, during after the September 1 too, if it's, things aren't working out very well. Especially last year after the derecho, I think I got a phone call from every one of my landlords asking if we're going to be all right or not, which was kind of nice, and it did turn out all right. So get into the marketing, price peaks tend to come in the April through June timeframe most years. There'll be 1 or 2 years out of 10 where you have a short crop and the high might come in the fall. And back when corn got up to $7, $8, everybody thinks you're making a fortune. Well, in order to sell it, those high prices, you have to pass up 4 and 5 and 6 all the way up, which are also good prices. And we typically do take advantage of those prices. So when it gets up to that high, they usually don't have much left to sell. And that's the reason they are that high, because they're bidding on what very little corn is left. So when you hear those prices, keep in mind that we don't hit the peaks. We hopefully don't hit the lows, but lows are easier to hit than peaks, it seems like. Like as I said before, we market grain for several months out of the year, well ahead of time, and then after the crop. Also, the yields you hear on the radio can be deceiving because people tend to call in their high yields and talk about them. They don't talk about all the lower yields and the very average ones.
Well, another thing that doesn't come up too, it seems like, depending on the year, if we have a lot of rainfall and we lose a lot of pond areas, in our situation, that's about 10% of our crop. And around those ponds is another area that's very lousy crop. So it's a pretty good portion. And that's a thing that can make a farm worth more or less. We have farms that have either no or very few pond areas, and we have farms that are probably at least a third you will lose in a wet year. Well, those things make a big difference on what that farm is worth in cash rent. But a lot of times a landowner will hear what the neighbor gets, and of course they want the same, but everything is different.
So then in summary, what we've all talked about is the November through February timeframe is harvest, fertilizer, applying manure, paying for seed, crop insurance. I don't know if we mentioned that or not, but that's the time of year where we have to prove our yields. Our yields are based on a 10-year average. So every year we have to provide information to document what our yields really were. Paying for chemicals, and then juggling taxes at the end of the year. And then
FSA
office, signing up for the farm program. Yeah, forgot that one.
And you have to certify telling after you've planted what you have planted everywhere.
Yeah, that comes in June probably.
Mm-hmm.
March through May is rent and land payments, machinery maintenance, field prep, planting, spraying. Then into the summer, June through August is
that's all playtime.
Yeah, that's all playtime. Finishing up spraying, machinery maintenance, some vacation, maybe prepay some inputs, and then getting into harvest. It's well, basically just pretty much harvest and any landlord negotiation in there too. So, and that's pretty much summarizes what we have to talk about. You know, like I say, we've been working with cover crops for about 8 years. We like them. The erosion benefits are tremendous and obvious. It is a learning curve, how to apply them, how to terminate them.
What to use, what not to use.
Yeah. We're still looking for that silver bullet. I don't think there is one. But my advice to any farmer is to, you know, you should be playing with it because, you know, the time may come when we have to, or your landlord wants you to. You know, if the landlord wants it done on their farm, I think they have a right to do that. But I also think they should share in the cost somewhat, since it is a long-term benefit. I know one woman who, her strategy was that first year she paid for all of it. Second year she paid for 3/4 of it, and then the third year they split it half and half. I think that was kind of a fair approach that she took, and then that's the way they, you know, left it at that. So, and she told me that each one of her tenants that did that, it ended up expanding their cover crop on other acres that they farm too. So that pretty much wraps it up for us. So back to Ruth.
Great. Well, thank you, Mike and Charles. That was really excellent. If you have any questions for Mike and Charles related to their presentation or just in general, feel free to type those into the chat, and we'll get to those during our Q&A time. I'm going to turn things over to Ruth. So if you guys want to do your spin/scoot routine, we'll let Ruth talk to us about agricultural cooperatives and what services farmers are using to help make decisions.
All right, just give me a second to switch on over. I have to quickly fire up my PowerPoint, and then I will share the screen and get it on over to everybody. All right. There we go, and then view full screen. All right, so you guys should see my full screen. Somebody give me a thumbs up if you can. Great, thanks, Jorgen. Awesome, thanks, Megan. All right, great. So This is going to be my portion. It's really hard to follow Mike and Charles because they are fantastic farmers. I work with them. Okay, if you see me laughing, it's because I've got a peanut gallery in the same room with me. It's going to be hard for me not to laugh sometimes. But anyways, I work with Mike and Charles. They're fantastic farmers. They utilize way more than just cover crops for conservation practices. I don't know if they mentioned it, but they've been no-till for something like 20 years too. So they're fun to work with. They do a lot of experimentation that they didn't mention. But anyway, I'll stop lauding praises upon them and I'll focus on what is an agricultural cooperative. And I know that a lot of the folks who are in this webinar today want to learn about, farming and what a co-op is and what people use them for. And so that's what I'm going to address. So without further ado, let's launch into it. All right, so this picture here is, I didn't take this picture. This is from a cooperative in Washington, but I love this picture. It's one of my favorites. And it's this idea of getting together early in the morning at the co-op or the elevator, having a cup of joe with some of the farmers that you work with, and then getting about with your day. And that, in my mind, sums up a co-op sometimes. This is one of the reasons I love going into the different locations that I work at, is hearing the banter, listening to the chit chat, and just connecting with the growers that I work with. But a co-op is so much more than this. And so let's go over what we're going to chat about what a co-op is. So the first thing we're going to address is what is the co-op? What does that mean? Then we're going to get into a very brief introduction of me and what I do for Heartland Cooperative. Then we're going to talk about the people you would see at a cooperative, the people you would work with at a cooperative, the services that a cooperative offers, the community role of a cooperative or an elevator, and then finally this question of, well, can you as a landowner come to the cooperative? And spoiler alert, the answer to that question is yes, but we will get into that. All right, so addressing this first one here. So what is an actual agricultural cooperative, right? Some folks might have that question. This is a very basic breakdown. Some of you might know what a co-op is, so this will be kind of review for you. But for those of you that don't know, you might hear a lot of terms. You might hear elevator or grain elevator. You might hear ag retailer. You might hear cooperative. And over time, all of those terms have really come to more or less represent the same business model that fulfills the similar needs of a farmer in an area, okay? So historically, a grain elevator, and it still is this way, but historically, grain elevators were located in small towns, and you brought your grain that you harvested to those elevators rather than getting in the horse and buggy and taking it all the way up to Minneapolis or down to St. Louis to sell at the river, right? You just sold it to the elevator in town and then they marketed it for you. But over time, elevators started to provide other agricultural services. They would have seed, they would start to sell inputs because it just made sense. If a farmer showed up to sell, his or her grain, then they could also pick up some seed or something on the way home, okay? And so that would be where the term elevator comes from. Now, a cooperative is, so a cooperative, the name actually comes from this concept of a group of farmers coming together. They pool their resources, their money, to cooperate together to purchase inputs or to market their grain together as a larger group because, there's strength in numbers, right? And so agricultural cooperatives could focus on just inputs, just buying like seed and fertilizers, or they would focus on just marketing grain, so like a cooperative elevator. And many cooperatives over time began to do both of those things. Some cooperatives also have a credit arm, so they can provide credit to farmers who are a member of that co-op. So that's an example of Heartland, right? We market grain, we provide inputs, and we also have a credit arm. And so then you get into the world of like ag retailers. You might hear the phrase ag retailer, and it's fair to call a co-op an ag retailer because we do sell retail agronomic supplies, right? But also you can look at ag retailers like Nutrient Ag Solutions, right? That's an example of an ag retailer that is not a cooperative. It's managed by an investor backed like board, and it's multinational and very large, and there's a place in the world for that business structure too in the agricultural world. So that's sort of a very blitzkrieg review of some of those terms and how they all fit together. But when you hear ag co-op, you can go ahead and think the takeaway here is the ag co-op is that small town. You can think of it as a place that farmers can go to get their inputs, their seed, or they can maybe market their grain throughout the year. All right, so really fast. If you didn't think I already spoke quickly enough, I'm gonna really speak fast here. So who am I? I'm, you know my name. I work as a conservation agronomist for Heartland Cooperative. And I don't just work out of one location. I work in Eastern Iowa, and my other half, Michael, he works in Western Iowa. And we work with multiple locations and multiple sales agronomists. I wear a few different hats. The big role, though, that I have is to provide education and content about conservation practices. I either work directly with farmers who want to learn more or want to adopt a new practice, or I work with sales agronomists, or I might work with like local community groups, like for instance, the Nevada FFA, to put on like educational events. So if you live in Eastern Iowa and you work with Heartland, eventually you are going to meet me if you haven't already. So who are the rest of the people, right? Like who are the other people that you're going to encounter in a cooperative? There's a lot. So I just put some pictures on here to give you an idea, but there's sales agronomists, there's pesticide applicators, there's fertilizer mix plant managers, our CEO, there's our CEO or our vice president. There's Secretary Naig in one of those pictures. This fella in the middle here is a proud no-tiller, and he uses contour farming and cover crops. I got a picture of him next to his big field sign. These guys at the bottom are some more of my growers that I took on a tour of saturated buffers. But all these people within a cooperative, they all have many roles. They don't just have one role. I wear a lot of hats, but other people that you encounter at a co-op also wear a lot of hats. And that brings me to this next boring slide. That's just a bunch of words. That's why I gave you pictures first. You've got sales agronomists at a co-op. They do what I do, only they focus on production systems. There's grain merchandisers and originators, folks that buy and sell grain. There's chemical applicators. There's the mixed plant managers. There's counter sales staff, the front line for customer support at a co-op. There's direct sales staff. There's feed mill managers. There's our board of directors, who are all farmers themselves and members of Heartland. Mike and Charles, to call them out, they're on our board. And then, of course, our most important aspect of our business would be our farmer customers, right? They are who make Heartland successful. And it takes all of these people wearing multiple hats to make a cooperative tick and run, right? So then what are the services that you can get from a cooperative? So I just ran off a list of who the people are that you might encounter at a co-op, but like what does a co-op do? Well, we provide agronomic consulting and scouting. You would get that from a sales agronomist. You might get that from me. Then there's seed and chemical and fertilizer sales. So the seed that you plant, the herbicides that you put down, the fertilizers that you put down, you would buy that from us, and you would work with the agronomists or the mixed plant managers to get those things. There's grain marketing after the harvest. If you want to sell your grain, you can do that through Heartland. We would help you with that. There's custom fertilizer and chemical application. Let's say you don't own a specific machine that is very expensive and you don't own it. You can use the cooperatives and we can apply it for you, right? There's soil sampling and interpretation. You can get soil samples to figure out if your fields are missing a nutrient or if they're low on something. If you need a loan, we have farm credit services that we offer, right? I personally help farmers with assistance with state and federal cost share and technical assistance programs. If somebody wants to try something new and they want to take advantage of a cost share program, I can help them sign up for that stuff. And there's a whole lot more, that we offer at the cooperative level. There's a couple things though. So I just talked about all the things we can do. There are a couple things you should understand about co-ops, and that is, at least here in the Midwest, cooperatives are really designed and they have the machinery and the infrastructure to support larger acreages, and typically it is to support commodity crops or livestock operations. So something that you don't always find at a co-op, and it's not intentional, it's just that's not how they're designed. You wouldn't necessarily get help from a cooperative to manage your apple orchard, at least not here in the Midwest, right? And we don't really service like small vegetable farms or anything like that. We're just not equipped to handle those things. Our machinery is way too big for that kind of thing, right? And we don't have the right chemicals, etc. I did put together a slide at the end of this with some resources for farms that are more diversified like that. And so just stay tuned and it'll be at the end of the slide set. We can talk about that briefly. All right, so we chatted about our services, we chatted about the people. What's our role within a community, right? So a cooperative can be really integral, especially to the smaller towns, but within communities in general, co-ops play a very big role. Sometimes we are the largest opportunity for local employment. Also, every co-op will invest in its local community projects with local nonprofits, or, in general, we just add to that tax base of that area. But every co-op has the leeway and the opportunity to invest in local projects, and they do quite frequently. So we can be a cornerstone of small communities, and that's fantastic. We also provide education and support to the general ag community, like with the FFA or 4-H. There's a lot of that going on as well. We really like to serve as kind of a hub of connection and friendship. And it's really important, I know at Heartland especially, to, we work very hard to keep as many locations thriving and functioning as possible so that we can serve as that kind of community glue. So then we'll come to my question of, so can you, as a landowner, can you come to a cooperative? And the answer is, if this isn't obvious enough, emphatically, yes, of course you can. If you own land and you're going to be playing some kind of a management role in how that land is specifically farmed, and you would need the services of a cooperative, you absolutely can come to a cooperative. And we actually have a lot of farmers who are in like sharecropping relationships with their landlords, like 50-50 sharecropping relationships, those kinds of things. And that's completely normal. And what I would encourage you landowners that are watching this webinar is to really especially focus on your communication with your renter, because one role that a cooperative cannot serve very well is as a middleman, right? So we frequently work with landlords and their renters together, but typically their communication has to be really strong, and then they work with us to achieve their goals together. One thing that a cooperative is not is we're not a land management company. That's not our role. And that's not, it's not a good use of anybody's time to ask a cooperative to do that. So I would really encourage you, if you're going to take a stronger role in managing your farmland, is to build a very strong communication base with your renter so that you can utilize the cooperative really to our best abilities, but also to your best value. All right, so I promised a slide of additional resources. So if you have farmland that you're thinking about, you want to have some organic production on it, or you want to have vegetable or fruit production, I just put the logos on this slide, but these are some organizations. I put Practical Farmers at the center because they do everything. They don't just work with grain farmers. They also have resources for vegetable farmers and small scale livestock farms, et cetera. But all of these entities on here can serve those kinds of needs and have educational resources for smaller or diversified farms. And so I would encourage you to Google these organizations and learn more about what services they offer. And also, I used to work in that world before I moved over into like large scale agronomy. And so if anybody has additional questions, my contact information is going to come up in a minute here, and you are welcome to email me to get some additional resources as well. So actually, I think with that, this is my thank you slide. That's my contact information. Don't be a stranger. And I'm going to open it up now to the next presenter and or questions.
Well, thank you, Ruth. There are questions piling up in the chat. We're going to hang on to them until our Q&A time. So I'm going to turn things over to Molly. Molly is Sustainability Director and a certified farm manager with People's Company. She's going to talk to us about professional farm management services.
Okay, everybody, how's that look? Can you see that?
Looks great.
Great. Thank you for the introduction, Jorgen. Just a few things we're going to run through today, and then I'm really looking forward to getting to this Q&A section of the webinar. Let me give an introduction similar to what I did last week, because I know we have a nice collection of new people this week. A typical week in the summer for me looks like visiting farms, walking fields, writing reports, and communicating with landowners. My last 7 days has been very heavy on the report writing and email and phone as we zero in on the September 1 lease deadline in Iowa. As I problem solve with farmers and landowners, I work to connect the expertise with the needs of each farm. This can be quick solutions or, very drawn out, depending on how Mother Nature cooperates and just, in general, the seasonality of our work. This can be frustrating when we're, wanting those quick answers, but also it gives us that time for ideas to percolate and just dial into the best outcomes. I really enjoy championing farmland landowners, being that advocate for landowners and finding that middle ground for what is best on each farm. And it's a responsibility that I take seriously, to be entrusted with being the eyes and ears for landowners, especially if he or she lives, far away from the farm. Okay, so my assignment today is to talk about the role of professional farmland management. But let's first just really quickly recap what we went over last week, because it truly sets the stage of how we need to be thinking about farmland management. So to start, we covered appreciation versus cash return. It can be easy to focus on that annual income as the only investment return component of farmland ownership, but we really need to commit to ongoing maintenance and improvement to maintain the integrity and value of that farm. And we need to maximize productive acres and protect those environmentally sensitive acres. And we do this by collecting the data and making decisions based on return on investment versus solely maximizing yield or cash rent. Last week we talked about we don't know what we don't measure. And if we can figure out how to solve those financial issues, there's almost always a positive environmental impact. And finally, just this active role of a landowner. We have to remember that conservation is a long game endeavor where each year of conservation practices builds on the previous. It does not make financial sense for a farmer to invest in conservation on a one-year lease. So we know there are many balls to juggle in operating farm and owning a farm. If you're not actively engaged in the ag industry, all the acronyms, programs, products can be overwhelming. And then you add on top of that new technology always around the corner and new scientific information being released. Even for landowners who have a good sense of today's trends in agriculture, it can be time consuming to be actively engaged on the farm. And so this is where professional farm management comes in. Professional farm managers are the advocate for the owner. This includes timely and personalized communications so the landowner can fully understand ongoing operations as well as those opportunities. It's representing the landowner on a wide variety of issues and working to identify and foster relationships with farmers who are aligned with the landowner's goals. Typically the farmer that fits this model does not require constant production decision oversight. It's a farmer that already is utilizing best practices and emerging technologies to increase productivity on the farm. Farm managers collect and analyze data to build out that farm history and is focusing on long-term appreciation. A good farm manager is able to cater a management plan specific to each landowner's needs. Some landowners need full management, while others, might want to be involved and need assistance on a smaller list of tasks. It could also be assistance in the more of a consulting role. I work with more and more landowners who need assistance on a very specific task. This could be finding a new tenant and writing that lease. It could be facilitating the process of enrolling new CRP acres, or finding and supervising contractors for a farm improvement project. And then some other consulting clients, it's just a quarterly phone call to check in, and so that landowner has a space to ask questions. They're the main communicator with their tenant, and they'll just kind of keep a running list of ideas to run by me, terms that maybe they're confused about, that they don't feel comfortable asking their tenant, and just kind of really kind of just a safe space to ask the dumb questions. There aren't any dumb questions, but sometimes it can feel like that. In the consulting role, it's typical for a farm manager to charge an hourly rate or a flat rate per task. Traditional farm management is typically a flat fee per acre or a % of gross revenue. farm management is not a one-way street. For a truly successful working relationship, the landowner has a role and a responsibility. When working with the new manager, the landowner must be very clear on expectations for the farm, as well as a working relationship with the manager. There must be a desire to maintain and improve the farm. This looks like setting aside funds annually for projects that help maintain productivity, as well as protecting, those environmentally sensitive acres. So the checklist I use for onboarding new clients would be just as easy for any landowner to follow on his or own farm. To begin with, it's getting very clear on and communicating landowner goals, type of farm lease, and type of farm operator. The type of farm lease refers to the level of participation the landowner wants in the farm operation. If the landowner wants involvement in decision-making on crop inputs, then a custom farming or crop share lease arrangement makes a lot of sense. If the landowner is more risk adverse, a cash rent lease arrangement would, might fit the bill better. Along with the lease, it's important to spend time thinking about what kind of tenant you want to work with. Does the existing tenant align with the identified landowner goals? If not, what is your tolerance and timeline for operating differently and are moving toward your goals? And this is, as a side note, choosing a farm operator is a vital step in achieving your goals. Farmland represents a major investment, and having an operator that is fully aligned with and committed to your goals is crucial to achieving the highest possible level of success. And, it makes sense that to let a tenant adjust to these new landowner goals. If it's the first time you're talking about it, you have to give them the opportunity to try and to accommodate. But if there's not a willingness to communicate and problem solve, then it's time for that discussion for, the future of that business partnership. If we can't get to the point of goals aligning. And I know that is a terribly loaded statement, and we could spend a whole webinar on landowner-tenant friction. But getting clear goals and aligning those goals with an operator fosters future success, and just generally, such a nicer way to work. This is an area where, we may need to consider short-term discomfort for long-term gain. On each farm, it's important to come up with a list of required data from the tenant. A reporting requirement can be written into the lease, and this is the data that can be collected and analyzed to build that farm history. And the historical data helps us make better decisions. When we know how the farm is producing, we can prioritize repair and maintenance projects. We can understand how to set more fair rent. We can identify acres that would benefit from another use other than in conventional production. As we better know the farm, we can analyze opportunities for additional income. Okay, so as we get rolling into managing a new farm and I put that checklist to work, there is a cycle that I follow: strategy, execution, improvement. It is a consistent loop of setting the building blocks for future decisions, documenting the specific boots on the ground tasks for implementing goals, and then addressing enhancement for asset appreciation. And I tend to think about running this management cycle in kind of three buckets: farm, environment, and income. So let's dig into farm first. In strategy, this looks like evaluating the full farm performance, considering current farm performance and opportunity for improvement. And this is important: setting goals that are specific, measurable, achievable, and time-based. Again, we've talked about creating an open line of communication, with your operator is critical for a positive working relationship. And, you know, that is as simple as, you know, making it a habit to calling your tenant maybe quarterly, maybe a handful of times during the summer, and just calling and seeing, you know, asking how things are going. And, you know, it's very common for me to pick up the phone when I'm driving down the road and call a tenant and say, you know, how are things on the farm? And then just see where the conversation takes you. I ask a lot of open-ended questions. I'll say, tell me more about how your fertilizer plans went this fall. Tell me about if you were able to get any waterway maintenance done this year. You know, it's easy to get caught up in what questions to ask, what kind of conversation to have. But I think the important part is just to let your tenant talk, let them explain and describe what's going on the farm. In execution, this looks like documenting landowner and operator roles in an annual written lease. A formal written lease allows both parties to put into writing their role and their responsibility. Collect that annual data, include a reporting requirement in the lease where you specifically request fertilizer, chemicals, and yield data. And ideally, this is, you know, actual receipts that shows the amount of product, and then application maps, so you know where the product was spread. You know, and the data collection could also include regularly scheduling soil testing on your farm. You know, this is a set of data that is really easy for the landowner to manage. An improvement, this looks like review that, you know, actually take the time to review it, analyze this operator reporting that you required. With data in hand, we're able to document and monitor financial performance, annual production, and fertility. Let's move into the environment bucket. In strategy, this looks like understanding your FSA and NRCS offices. These county offices can be a really helpful source of information as well as provide potential cost share for projects. And that's as simple as calling in. When we get past COVID, it's as simple as walking in and just walking up to the counter, telling them who you are, your farm, and asking for the information and how they can help you. Figuring out other active groups in your area. Is there an organized watershed? Is there a local Women, Land, and Legacy chapter? Are there PFI field days nearby? And then the other piece is identifying your conservation vision. Put down on paper both your short and long-term conservation desires for the farm. In execution, we're going back to that written lease, which really is your roadmap on all aspects of the farm. Include terms of annual lease that specifically list the conservation practices and the responsibility of both landowner and operator. You know, what we often write into our conservation leases is how to approach cover crops. Who's going to pay? Who's going to order the seed? How will the cover crop be planted? And typically it is a shared landowner tenant expense, and we'll say very specifically that tenant will order cover crops to be flown on in early September pending weather. Tenant will pay, landowner will reimburse 50% of expense. So something as simple as that. In the improvement column, this looks like use collected data to identify the most productive and most, and then also the most environmentally sensitive acres of each field. And with that mindset, move forward with decision making. And then finally, our income bucket. In strategy, this looks like, you know, encouraging a level of transparency between landowner and tenant where both parties are working towards the same revenue goals. In execution, this looks like identifying additional income and cost-saving opportunities. Consider other cash crops, consider retiring marginal tillable acres and enrolling them into CRP, Consider opportunities for income in renewable energy and recreational leases. Improvement column, this looks like identifying capital improvement projects that fit into strategic planning, address drainage, farmability, curb appeal projects to increase productivity. So this is a real quick overview of the role of farm managers, but I hope it was enough to provide you with a roadmap to better ask questions if you find yourself in the position of interviewing a potential farm manager, or perhaps it's some ideas on how to better partner with an existing farm manager or simply your tenant. As a landowner, you're living in Iowa, you're very fortunate to live in a state with a booming farm management industry. There are talented and well-intentioned farm managers in every corner of the state. And as I think about the landowner tenant manager relationships that I feel like they are thriving in my own book of business, they all share some common aspects. Clear communication. No one is a mind reader. Everyone needs to ask for what they need. And then understanding the seasonality of the work at hand. This can be especially true for the tenant and manager. Part of the year we're sitting at our desk, and the other part of the year we are spending all day on the road, all day on the farm. And so what are realistic expectations for each season? And then the last thing would be transparency in information sharing. We cannot work towards fairly sharing income and expenses without that production data. In the next webinar, we'll go, dig deeper into farm leases and how to set rent, fair rent. And so in the meantime, I'm happy to answer questions along with today's other speakers as we wrap up.
Thank you, Molly. That was excellent. We do have quite a few questions here. I'm going to echo what Molly said. There were quite a few questions about like leasing length and some leasing provisions. We'll get to those today, but if you want to talk about those things more in depth, you should tune in next week, because next week's webinar is going to focus on leasing strategies pretty heavily. I also want to say we're going to do our best to get through all these questions. If you have to hop off, as we approach 1:30, please do so. I think we're going to try and stick around and answer as many of these as we can. So if we don't get to your question, feel free to follow up with one of us. We're happy to answer, but otherwise we're going to try and stick around. So I'm just going to work my way here through the chat. So Evelyn asked when the owner paid, so this is for Mike and Charles, I'm sorry. When the owner paid for the cover crop, what did that include? Seed, drilling, other costs? And then Chris asked a question, how many of your landowners help pay for cover crops? So maybe you can tell us how many of your landowners actually help share costs, and then what that cost share looks like.
Well, usually it's included the seed and the cost of applying, depending on, how you apply, airplane, highboy, drill. But usually the landlord, if the farmer was drilling it and he already had a drill, he might, throw that in. But generally it's been, usually when people are starting out, they like to go with an airplane or a highboy or something. But so usually it's split application and seed cost. But there's also cost share available for both the landlord and the tenant, or on that farm. They can't both get it, but one or the other can, or they can split that too. And I've done that in the past too, is split the cost share.
Yeah, that's a great point. Landowners, like farmers, can apply for various cost share and receive that money as well. There's a couple questions here about anhydrous. So Miriam asks, my farmer prefers anhydrous rather than liquid N. What are your feelings about this? So that might be down to the farmer's preference, but if you have any thoughts. And then Chris asks, do you do most of your anhydrous work in the fall? And so on Chris's farm, they've switched to cover crops and less tillage. Do you see any movement in that direction?
Well, we try to do most of our anhydrous in the fall. We prefer it over liquid, partly for cost and stability. And like I say, we try to do it in the fall. In the spring, you get more compaction issues by running this equipment over the field. So we try to minimize that as much as we can. And if you do it in the fall, you'll have the freeze and thaw that'll take care of that compaction. Plus, typically there's less in the fall.
And we always do it when the ground is below 50 degrees. In fact, we're usually pushing freeze up more likely. And it's just like your refrigerator or freezer, you know, there's just really no biological activity in the winter time to break it down until it warms up in the spring. And then usually people are right on it as soon as they can in the spring anyway. So I don't usually see that much difference. We have never seen a yield loss from putting it on the fall. In fact, we've seen a yield gain. And we also use a stabilizer to help hold it in place. I've never been a fan of liquid because liquid can be gone and with a big rain, you know, you pay more for it and it's just a highly unstable product.
Great.
That's just my opinion though.
And we still have earthworms.
Yeah.
Perfect. Ruth, there's a couple questions here related to co-ops. I'm going to try and combine some of them. So Rod asked, are farm co-ops owned by farmer members? Evelyn asked, do you have to be a member of the co-op to buy inputs and sell grain? And I do just want to call attention. Maggie made a comment here in the chat. I just want to read because I think it's a good one. So she said, many people in my hometown think that they can't shop at the co-op country store since they aren't farmers and not members of the co-op. I'm constantly explaining to people that the co-op is just like any retail store. They should shop there rather than going to big box stores in the large city. They should support the local co-op retailer. So it sounds like there's opportunities for folks to shop even if they're not a co-op member, but maybe you can speak to a couple of those questions.
Yeah, I mean, yes, yeah, you can buy from a co-op if you are not a cooperative member. That's not a problem. And there was a question you asked at the beginning. Are co-ops managed by the farmer? Yes, the farmer
Owned by
members.
the farmers.
Yep, the farmer members own and manage the cooperative. So there's, you know, the benefit of profit sharing that is involved in that, right? So as much as you pay in to the cooperative as a part of your membership, you will receive a certain percentage back after so many years of being a member of that cooperative. And our board of directors, every farmer that's on our board of directors is also an owner customer of the cooperative as well. It means that everybody definitely knows what's going on and everybody knows everybody, and it is just a fantastic community.
Great. Ruth, while the camera's on you, Maureen had a question while you were speaking about how you intersect with the NRCS, which is the Natural Resources Conservation Service of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, in case you're not up on your acronym soup. So maybe you want to talk a little bit about NRCS and the services they provide versus the services that a co-op might provide.
Yes, yeah, that's a great question. And actually, so it speaks to my role specifically as a conservation agronomist. I work very closely with some of the district conservationists in each county, and a district conservationist is employed with the NRCS, which is housed in the offices of the USDA and FSA, and every county has at least one of those, if not more. And I work for the cooperative, and I work as a sort of a liaison between our farmers and our sales agronomists and the county district conservationists with the NRCS and any, you know, state employees with IDALs, et cetera, on like cost share and conservation programs. So I am unique. Not every cooperative has one of me. I'm actually pretty new, and Heartland last year decided to bring on a couple conservation agronomists to address that specific need and desire of our grower members to adopt conservation. Contrary to popular belief, there's actually a lot of farmers who are adopting conservation practices and they need help figuring it out. And they specifically need help navigating state and federal programming at the USDA NRCS offices. And that's where my role comes in. So, I mean, I'm not paid by the government. I'm paid by Heartland. I'm a Heartland employee, but I work very closely with the NRCS offices. And, you know, take heart, there's more and more cooperatives who are going to be bringing on conservation agronomists. Heartland is not like a weird unicorn in this. They just were the earliest to bring us on, but there's more and more getting hired. I'm meeting with a new conservation agronomist with a cooperative in Northwest Iowa actually next week. So there's more and more of us. So take heart, you will see more of us in the future. I hope that answers that question.
I think so. I think that's good. I did put a link in the chat here to the service center locator. So that's a nice map, you click down under your state and then click your county, and then it gives you the contact information for your service center. I guess I would encourage landowners, the service center, NRCS and FSA is where a lot of that cost share and financial assistance and technical assistance comes from for those government programs. So, Mike and Charles just referenced that landowners can also get cost share for some of those cover crop things. So if you haven't had a conversation with your local service center, that would be a good thing to do, I think. Ari had a question, what % of farmland in Wisconsin and Illinois are rented? And I tried to do some research, and in Illinois actually has a higher percentage of rented farmland than Iowa. Something like 76% on average of Illinois farmland is rented. But that farmland is 30% crop share and 46% cash rent. And I think in Iowa, you will find a much larger percentage of cash rent. Molly's nodding her head, so I'm not making that up. I could not find any information about Wisconsin. I don't know, Molly, if you know off the top of your head anything about Wisconsin. No. Chris had a question for Mike and Charles. Of your landlords, are they all cash rent or any crop share or like a flex lease? That's the other type.
We have mostly cash rent, but we have one flex lease and we have one, it's a cash rent, but it's based on the income of that farm for the year.
Mm-hmm.
And if the river comes out, it affects the.
So different models. We're going to talk about some of those models in more detail next week. But we talked a little bit about crop share versus cash rent. We'll talk about a flex lease, I think, maybe next week. That's kind of a hybrid between the two, but different models of leasing. So I'm sorry, I'll try to do some research on Wisconsin land ownership and see if I can dig into some of the data and find that, and I can share that. Molly, Rod had a question. What is the optimum length of lease to make conservation methods attractive to a farmer? So maybe Molly, you can take that from what you see working with farmers and landowners, and then we can ask Mike and Charles their opinion.
What has worked for me is to actually have a shorter lease, a year, a couple of years. But once you have a good working relationship between landowner and tenant, to make that, pretty clear in the communication that this partnership is working. We both are working towards the same goals. But, a new lease, if you're writing those conservation pieces and kind of the role of each party and it's used as a roadmap, that probably should be revisited, updated more regularly. So maybe that looks like a new lease every 1 year or two. Maybe it looks like having a consistent lease and then having an addendum that's discussed every year. Also with the market volatility, if you're in a cash rent, flat rate rent, you need to consider that too, as the markets change, what's fair. And so if it's easier to have a longer term lease if you have, kind of a hybrid lease with a flex. So I guess given rent rates and using the lease as your roadmap, I might be more inclined to have a shorter term lease, but be very open with communication about this is where we're going. I want to work with you, but I also want to be fair on that rent. So we're going to work together longer term, but we're going to update that contract.
I have to remember to unmute. I think that goes back to what Mike and Charles were saying about the relationship being important. I don't know, Mike and Charles, how do you feel about length of lease?
Yeah, I don't care so much about the length as, the relationship and how comfortable you are in that relationship. Do you feel like this is a long-term situation, or is this just a year-to-year situation? And, generally, if the landlord is reasonable on the rent or a flex rent, then, and you're able to make money, kind of year in and year out, not just on the really good years, you're probably more apt to put more back into the conservation and so forth. And if the, you know, if the owner is willing to, you know, share part of it also. Going back to that cost share, you know, like in the NRCS, we can get about 160 acres worth of cost share. So we might use that up very quickly on some of ours, but if the landlord can apply on their farm, that's where it could be very helpful because it apply for it in their name.
Yeah. There was another question here. Elena asked a question, do you have a model for conservation practices in a lease? I'm going to plug some resources into the chat here, but I don't know, Mike and Charles, I mean, sometimes I think you see conservation practices written into the lease. Molly kind of alluded to that. I'm interested to hear, Mike and Charles, is that stuff usually written into your lease or is that negotiated outside of that lease term?
I don't think we have any written in a lease.
No.
It's mostly a verbal, do you want to work together and do this or not?
We've only had one landlord approach us that wanted cover crops. Well, I guess now two. So, and we have not approached our landlords yet because we're just playing with it on a lot of our own ground. Because I don't even know what a lot of our landlords, what their opinion would be of it. So we haven't taken that step yet because we're still just kind of finding our way and figured out what works and what doesn't work. But if one of them approached us and said they'd like to do it, then, you know, we're kind of ready because we've been playing with it.
I would add, Jorgen, that sometimes you need to just, even if it's discussed and it's all agreed, sometimes it benefits to have an abundance of you know, that added into the lease if there's a lot of more than one owner involved. You know, sometimes we're very specific in the lease because there's 5 siblings that own that farm. And so getting everything written down might feel over the top to the tenant, but it gives a sense of understanding to the landowner group, and you know, they can, you know, they're not thinking about the farm every day, and so if they want to remember what we decide on cover crops, they can go to the lease and say, oh yeah, that's what we agreed upon.
Yeah, that's a great point, Molly. I also think I caution against sometimes being overly prescriptive in a lease too, in terms of what conservation practices are included. And I understand that desire to use the lease as a tool to like guide what's going to happen on that farm. Mm-hmm. But I think that can lead to some problems as well.
It's a really good point, because Mother Nature can, you know, you can have the best intentions and then Mother Nature can mess it up. So really good point.
Okay, I put some links in there. Iowa State, the Ag Decision Maker, they have some different leasing addendums and leasing templates and things that you can look at. Some of those are specific to splitting costs for conservation infrastructure and conservation practices, so that might be of use. I put Practical Farmers landowner page in there. There's a whole bunch of resources. And then the Land Stewardship Project maintains a really comprehensive and almost overwhelming conservation leasing guide. So if you really want to see the potential out there, that's one resource you can look at. Karen asked a question here, Molly, what farm data do you recommend collecting? And Molly, maybe you can take a stab at that, and then maybe Ruth can try and answer that too from her perspective. And you covered this in your later slides, I think, a little bit. So
yeah, what I would love to know from every farmer is fertilizer, chemical applied, and bushels harvested. Farther down on the list, if they want to tell me, you know, a little information about planting, what, you know, kind of their seed and germination. And that's more of just a learning opportunity to start a conversation of like, that's interesting that you used, you know, that population rate, what went into that decision. Just so the landowner can learn more about, you know, how a tenant approaches, you know, maximizing production on that farm. On fertilizer, I really want to see a crop removal rate. I use Iowa State numbers, using actual yield, and do those calculations to confirm that the farmer is putting on at least what he has taken off. And again, it's a good conversation starter. Like, tell me how you decided to put that level of phosphorus, that level of potassium on. What was your yield goal? And as we think about fertility, how can we partner together and think about improving soil health?
Ruth, from your perspective as a conservation agronomist, what data do you want to know?
Yeah, so my perspective is very different on this, because in my role as an agronomist, I'm more concerned about overall return on investment on an acreage and whether or not there are poor performing areas that it just doesn't make sense to continue to farm the way that they're being farmed. And I frequently work with, so again, my customer base is the actual landowners who are also farmers. I don't work with landowners who are non-operating landowners. So the farmers that I'm working with come to me because they have areas that they're thinking to themselves, all right, I'm tired of farming this wet chunk. I think that I could get more for it if I enrolled it in CRP. I'm going to work with Ruth, and we're going to look at my yield data over the last however many years. We're going to look at what I've spent on fertilizer or inputs. We're going to look at machinery costs, those kinds of things. And then we're going to compare that to maybe some state or federal program that I could enroll this into Habitat, or I could enroll it into CRP. And maybe it just makes more sense for me to do that, and it will be less frustrating for me to manage it that way. So and again, I'm not working with landlords. I'm working with farmers who also own that property. So it's just there are certain things that there's data I don't want to know, and there's data I just don't care about because they're coming to me to implement conservation. So really the data I'm looking at specifically is anything that feeds into return on investment on a parcel of land and how we can improve that. And if it means taking it out of production or changing management, putting in strips, putting in contour strips, something like that maybe, or just putting a parcel into like prairie pothole program or something. And I work very closely with either Pheasants Forever or NRCS folks or state staff. Then the ideas get brought to me. I work with the farmers, and then we all sit down with staff members at the state or federal level who can then help us all implement those plans. So I hope that answers that.
Yeah, I think that's good. That's kind of the...
Sorry, can I add one more thing quick?
I suppose.
I think it's important to remember that, especially in a cash rent lease, that tenant has the right to quiet and personal enjoyment of what they've rented. So being mindful that it is a cash rent lease, the landowner is not making production decisions. They don't have any risk in the crop. And so, figuring out what's the most helpful for you to know as a landowner to help improve the farm, but then also respecting that the tenant has an overall operation that they are running, and they're making financial decisions, business decisions, not based just on your farm. So, kind of balancing that of wanting to know about your farm to make better decisions, but also respecting, the privacy and the business decisions of your tenant.
Yeah, thanks for that, Molly. I think that's important context. So I do want to say we are at 1:30. I want to make one final pitch. When you see an email in 3 or 4 weeks with an evaluation from us, don't ignore it. Please tell us how we did. Please tune in next week to talk more about some of these leasing strategies and communication strategies with your tenant. If you have to hop off, feel free to do so. I want to respect everybody's time. I think if our panelists are okay, we're going to keep going for a few minutes and try and answer some of these last few questions. That's okay with our panelists? Okay.
Charles may give everyone a hard time for making him late to the cabin.
Oh, okay. Well, just a few minutes. We won't try and make him too late. Chris had a question for Mike and Charles. How do you decide which fields or landowners get planted first? Or how do you prioritize amongst your your various rented ground? And you don't have to answer this if it's too personal. I don't know. We don't want to upset anybody.
It's strictly the condition of the field. It's not
Okay.
one or the other. Even when our dad was around, we didn't always pick his fur. It's strictly weather related.
Great.
Oh, I was gonna say something.
Mike and Charles, while the camera is on you, you made a good point, I think, early on in your presentation that any time is a good time to talk about some of these things. But then I noticed in your presentation that you're making different decisions, sometimes well in advance and sometimes at different parts of the year. So I think it's fair to say that you can talk to your farmer at any time about these things, but maybe we need to manage expectations a little bit about when things are going to be implemented. And I don't know, like, what's the lead up time if you have a farmer or a landlord who approaches you about doing cover crops? Like, what's the lead up time to actually getting that done? Is it a year? Is it more?
Oh, yeah, 3 months to a year would be good, I would say.
Yeah.
It kind of depends on the farmer. If you got experience at it, it's not that hard to implement it fairly quickly. If you don't have any experience, you might want to do a little bit of research on their own too.
It depends too on, if a landlord would come to us in August and say, well, I want cover crop, it depends on what is available for seed. Sometimes that's short supply and the availability to get it on. The derecho last year changed a lot of cover crop plan because of the ground applied. Plus, when your crop gets blown over, you get out of the mood about anything. When you have that tough a crop to take out. Typically we put 300 hours a year on a combine. Last year we put 400 just because of all the down corn. Well, those things affect your attitude and whether you even care about cover crops or not. But starting, the farther ahead you talk about it, the more chance you get it done the way they would like it to be done. But it isn't hard to come up with something kind of close to last minute if there's seed available.
Right. And if the farmer knows how to do it or is comfortable doing it.
Yeah, because it's not just planting, it's knowing how to terminate it or when to terminate it. And
Right.
They do have a few months to try to figure that out, but.
Right. While you're here, Ruth asked if you could both talk just a little bit about what you see the primary benefits of cover crops as being. So just like 1 or 2 bullet points. Why are they valuable for you?
Soil erosion is one of the big things that we like. If a ground is a little bit rolly, it's awful nice. And we like rye in corn to go to beans the following year. And we'll plant in that rye green and then terminate it after the beans are up. So that's worked real well for us. Where I don't like rye is ahead of corn. That can be a problem. We had a fill this year. It was a real problem. Typically we don't have a dry spring, so rye ahead of corn isn't as bad, but this year it dried the ground all out.
Mm-hmm.
So now we know in a dry year, you terminate cover early.
And often that ability of the crop to dry the ground out is a plus, right? Like that field fitness aspect is something I hear a lot from farmers that they like about cover
Some years
crops.
it's a good thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Most years we fight mud in the spring, it seems like. And so,
Right.
yes, it does. And it helps hold you up.
Some of the other benefits we've seen is it seems to be, if you get a good stand, there's some weed control from it early. Not season long, but early. And wildlife, the pheasants love it. It's fantastic nesting habitat for pheasants.
Yeah. As long as it's there long enough.
Huh?
As long as it's
Well-
on there long enough.
By accident, a year ago, we had it there long enough.
Yeah.
Yeah. So while you're here, Rob asks, what area of farming or what information do you think your landlords need to know more to help with the communication piece? So what do you wish that your landlords knew when you go to talk to them about their farms?
Well, I like a yield map, not so much for the yield, but to show the bad spots in the farm where tile would make a big difference. Or like Maggie said, or what's your name? Ruth. Like Ruth said, you know, there's some areas of fields that we pay rent on and we don't farm it. We just leave it because it's cheaper to leave it than to invest any money at all. And this is what the yield maps will show.
Okay. So just an understanding of what areas are more profitable or maybe less
Right.
profitable. Yeah.
I have seen too, it seems like, and our dad was a real good one for this, their farm is the best one in the world. A lot of landlords think theirs is the best. And our dad, he had us convinced this was the best. And our home farm is a little wet, but we knew that was the best until we started farming some that rolled a little bit to a creek and we didn't have ponds. So there's a little bit of that goes along with it too.
All right. Ruth, Maggie asked, as a conservation agronomist, will you work with a non-operator landowner who wants to put more conservation onto his or her land in cooperation with the farm operator? So I mean, you're primarily working with the farmers themselves. Is there ever a time where you would start the conversation with a landowner first?
Yeah, yes. I have worked with non-operator landowners, and I do work with a few right now. I have learned in the last year that sometimes, and it's, you know, it's not intentional, of course, but we run into the issue where I start working with a non-operating landowner and then we rapidly discover that their farmer tenant is also Heartland's customer. And that creates an awkward conflict of interest between me and the landlord and the tenant, which would be why I made that point in my presentation about, hey, it's not the cooperative employee's role to serve as your middleman. So like communicating directly with your tenant is really important, that you manage that relationship and that you don't expect the co-op employee to do it. So I've been burned by that, right? But this is how we learn, right? And this is how we improve our services. So I do have several customers that I'm working with right now who are non-operator landowners. And one of the first things I find out is, okay, and is your farmer also a customer of Heartland? Like, do we need to navigate that? Does everybody need to sit at the table and have a conversation so we're all on the same page? If you want to work with me and I really want to work with you, non-operator landowner, then arrange that discussion and let's make that happen so that we can all be on the same page. But yes, I do, Maggie, would love to work with you. Reach out to me.
Great. Maggie also made a comment here, and I think this is a good ending point and then a good pitch for our session next week. But Molly, you know, at the end of your last answer, you made a point about having an appreciation of what is appropriate for a landowner to dictate in a cash rent situation, and how that tenant has the right to quiet enjoyment and has the right to some decision making about that farm in a cash rent situation. So Maggie says Molly's last point is exactly why I prefer a crop share model over a cash rent model. I own the land for the long term. I don't want the renter making decisions that may not be good for the long-term soil health. So I think the takeaway there is, if you want more control day to day in how your farm is managed, the crop share lease allows that, but you also then share in the expenses. I think we'll talk more about that next week when we talk about different types of leases. But we are at 1:40, so we're 10 minutes past time. I want to thank Molly and Ruth and Mike and Charles for joining us today and sharing all that information. I think I will just let us go with that because we are over time. So thanks everybody for attending. I hope you join us next week and the week after. We will see you all soon.